It's time for another installment of Voting and Elections. And it's not a moment too soon because the election is in. Check my watch. It's really soon. So here we go. Chapter 5. Open up Epic. Use the link in our Google Classroom to open Epic. Play this video and read along. Chapter 5, the right to vote. Today, most U.S. citizens who are at least 18 can vote in federal, state, and local elections. This was not always the case. When our country was new, when the nation was new, only white men aged 21 and older who owned property could vote. As a result, only 6% of Americans could vote in the first U.S. presidential election in 1789. That doesn't sound very fair. The right to vote slowly expanded. Former slaves, Native Americans, immigrants, and women received the right to vote. To guarantee voting rights, Congress and the states amended the Constitution. Amended means they adjusted it, they changed it. Today, more than 1/3 of the Constitution's amendments focus on voting rights. African American voters. The U.S. Congress ratified the 15th Amendment in 1870. It protected the voting rights of former slaves. They could not be denied the right to vote because of their race or because they had been slaves. Despite this, former slaves faced problems at the polls. Many faced violence if they tried to vote. Some states charged a poll tax, and that means they had to pay before they voted. Sometimes voters had to pass a reading test. Many former slaves were poor and could not read. The violence, taxes, and tests made voting nearly impossible for them. And I'm heading to the sidebar here on page 36. Perspectives, lowering the voting age. Beginning in World War II, from 1939 to 1945, Americans began to push for a lower voting age. The U.S. Constitution required a citizen to be 21 years old to vote. When Americans were drafted into the military for World War II, they were only 18. They believed if they were old enough to fight, they were also old enough to vote. Kind of makes sense, right? The movement gained more power during the Vietnam conflict, also known as the Vietnam War. In July 1971, President Richard Nixon signed the 26th Amendment into law. The act lowered the voting age to 18. And the caption underneath that wild-looking picture says, an 1870 print celebrating the passage of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. These practices continued until 1964. And you know what, I'm going to go back because we probably don't remember what practices, huh? What? The practice of people having to pay voting taxes and, and having a hard time voting. These practices continued until 1964. That year, the states ratified the 24th Amendment. It outlaws, makes illegal, poll taxes. Then, in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. It prevents states from discriminating at the polls. After the act passed, more than 250,000 African Americans registered to vote for the first time. Citizenship. Many other minority groups also had to fight for the right to vote. The challenge they faced was becoming citizens. Laws from the 1800s and early 1900s prevented some immigrants and Native Americans from becoming citizens. This stopped them from voting. Native Americans were not citizens for much of the nation's history. It's kind of crazy, right? Because we know who was here first. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. It made all Native Americans U.S. citizens. This opened up the right to vote. For many years, Asian immigrants were not allowed to become citizens. In 1952, Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act. It allowed Asian immigrants to become citizens. With it, a whole new community of voters grew. Women. Women also had to fight for their right to vote. In 1848, approximately, that means about 100 Americans met in Seneca Falls, New York, to talk about women's rights. They wanted better rights for women, including their right to vote. Changing laws came slowly. By the early 1900s, women began using new methods to attract attention to their cause. They picketed and held rallies. Do you know what picketing is? When you hold a sign and you walk back and forth, you stand outside to get people's attention. When the United States, sidebar, a really famous person is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an early leader of the women's rights movement. In 1848, she helped organize the nation's first convention on women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York. She also gave speeches and wrote articles. Stanton died in 1902. Her leadership inspired women to stand up for the cause. Women finally won the right to vote in 1919. All right, at the bottom of the page. When the United States entered World War I, 1914 to 1918, women used it to their advantage. They believed that the best way to make the world safe was to ensure democracy for all citizens at home. Lawmakers agreed. The U.S. Congress approved the 19th Amendment in 1919. The states ratified it in 1920. It gives women the right to vote. Voting matters. Voting is one of the most important responsibilities of American citizenship. It allows citizens to choose their leaders and make their voices heard. In the United States, every citizen's vote matters. Straight to the source. On May 17, 1957, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a group in Washington, D.C. about voting rights. Give us the ballot and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. Give us the ballot and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill. Give us the ballot and we will place judges on the benches of the South who do justly and love mercy. All right. Continuing, changing minds. How does King's speech persuade others to support laws guaranteeing civil liberties such as voting? What makes King's speech persuasive? I like how he just keeps saying the same thing. Give us the ballot, give us the ballot, give us the ballot. And you remember that phrase. Good job, Dr. King. And so, my dear students, let's see, there's a little bit more to this. Oh, there's a little bit more than a little bit more, huh? All right, that is the end of the story, huh? Okay. Fast facts on page 42. The United States is an indirect democracy. Its citizens elect leaders to represent them on the local, state, and federal levels of government. So that's, remember we read about the Electoral College, so it's not, we don't have a direct democracy. It's indirect because we have that Electoral College. Candidates who want to run for president, vice president, senator, and representative must meet the requirements listed in the U.S. Constitution. The United States has two main political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Each party nominates candidates for office. Americans elect a president and vice president every 4 years. The election is held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Each state can run elections in its own way. Voting requirements can vary. That means they can be different from state to state as long as they do not violate the U.S. Constitution. When citizens vote for president, the results are called the popular vote. A candidate can win the popular vote but lose the election if he or she does not have enough electoral votes. On election day, citizens are actually voting for electors in the Electoral College. The electors are the ones who elect the president and vice president. For many years, voting rights only extended to male citizens older than the age of 21. African Americans, Native Americans, women, and some immigrants were not allowed to vote. The U.S. Congress and states have ratified 7 amendments to extend voting rights to more groups. This is a long chapter, isn't it? Stop and think. Tell the tale. Chapter 5 discusses the many groups that were unable to vote when the country was formed. Imagine you are a member of one of those groups, a woman, an enslaved person, that means a slave, a Native American, or an immigrant, and write a letter to a friend explaining your situation, including some reasons why you would like to vote. Surprise me. Chapter 4 explains how the Electoral College works. What did you find most surprising about it? Write down 3 facts about the Electoral College that you didn't know before. Why were these facts surprising? Dig deeper. After reading this book, what questions do you still have about voting and elections? Ask a librarian to show you additional resources about the topic. Make a list of 3 new things you learned after your research. Say what? Much of the language in the U.S. Constitution is formal and was common at the time of the nation's founding. Pick an article or amendment from the Constitution that has to do with voting rights and rewrite it in today's language. Use a dictionary to look up any words that are unfamiliar. So students, we are going to be working on this next week. All right, you don't have to do it. You don't have to do anything with it today, okay? But on Tuesday, voting day, we're going to be digging into this, okay?